When the first nuclear bomb was tested in New Mexico, Oppenheimer, the guy who organized its creation, quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, the closest Hindu equivalent to the Bible, where Lord Vishnu said, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." To be honest, it's kinda cliché to bring that up when you talk about nuclear war, but there's often a reason for clichés, since they work. By entering the atomic age, humanity very clearly started having the power of gods, power that the ancient Hindus, who knew more about the cosmos than we give them credit for, could only compare to what Vishnu had. What this meant is that man entered the era where we could wipe out the whole of modern urban civilization in an afternoon. In the 80 years since, the human race has been tested on whether we can resist this temptation. It reminds me of another ancient story, the Sword of Damocles, where an ancient Greek king was talking to one of his servants. The servant said he would love to be in the king's position, and the next day the king brought him onto his throne, with a giant sword hanging above his head by a single thread. The king said that this was what the life of being a king was like, since so many envied him and were plotting to replace him. Imagine if you took someone from 200 years ago and they were shocked by all the technological advancement of our times and all the wealth we have, but then we'd have to explain to them how our entire civilization hung under the sword, like King Damocles. This video is going to talk about if our whole civilization is fated to have this unimaginably terrible fate. Will the sirens ring into the night and the great cities of the world burn into irradiated, chaotic wastes? And will we slink into another dark age? Also, with how tense the political situation is, especially with Chinese warmongering and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this topic is very topical, and it brings up real concerns that we'll investigate here. Looking back at this video, I'm excited for all of you to watch it. It shatters most people's conceptions of reality in a very key way, and looks at the world in a way a lot of people don't. I say this for a lot of my videos, and I hope it's true, but you'll leave this with a totally different view of your life from when you started. Well, let's get a Geiger counter in our hands and have some uranium fever. During a panic attack, you should start by trying to make contact with actual physical things, and then name the physical things in your proximity. I love the M. Byhold song 12345, which goes through this process. The complete horror of nuclear war, which we all subconsciously know and feel, makes it difficult to think about it clearly, and so that we can have an actual, clear, rational discussion here, I will do the same thing, and go through the realities of nuclear arsenals today. There are 2 countries with nuclear arsenals of real size, and that's been the case for the whole history of the atomic world. Those being Russia and America, which each have around 5,000 nukes, down from highs of over 20,000 during the height of the Cold War. After that, it's a very long jump to Britain, France, and China, which have around 300 each. Then Pakistan and India have 150 each, Israel 90, and North Korea 20. This means that the only 2 countries capable of actually ending modern civilization are Russia and America. Even a nuclear war between India and China wouldn't be able to kill significant parts of each country's 1.5 billion people. Thus, for the only situation that would actually have severe long-term effects that could seriously damage the world system would be a nuclear war between Russia and America. The reason that America and Russia have not fought a nuclear war so far is due to a good position in choice dynamics. Situations like global warming have the worst choice dynamics in that everyone is polluting the climate all over the world all the time, thus making systems of accountability or responsibility very difficult or impossible, and thus it's difficult to solve the problem. Nuclear war is the exact opposite, in that there are really 2 people in the whole world who can decide if we'll have a major nuclear war. These people are incentivized to keep the world from ending since they're already running world superpowers. Also, America and Russia are both oversized empires that don't really need to use nukes for survival, in the same way countries like France or Germany, who are very tight neighbors who could easily conquer the other, would probably have during the World War I or the Franco-Prussian War if they had them. We should also add some other details on top of this. The first being that most of these nuclear arsenals are not effective. For Russia, America, and more, as horrifying as it sounds, these nuclear arsenals are not maintained to close enough a degree as necessary, and so a majority will not work if we try to fire them. Our maintenance systems are so bad we don't even know which ones are functional. This is even more true since the rockets that we can use to fire nukes are also very poorly maintained, and we have nowhere near enough of the rocket to deliver these nukes, thus meaning you should cut the actually useful useful nuclear arsenals to, I would guess, around a quarter of what the official numbers are. I know it's good writing to keep your audiences in anticipation until the very end, and I kinda have a reputation for doomerism on this channel. However, I'm gonna lower all of your collective blood pressures a few notches this one time. The actual chances of nuclear war in our lifetimes are pretty low. This is since if you look at the self-interests in Russia or America, there's not really a reason for nuclear war. America is a humanitarian-focused nation where if, say, the Republicans start a nuclear war that kills 400 million people outside of America, for a bad reason, their party will simply stop existing, and either the Democrats will rule America for 40 years straight, or the Libertarians will replace them. We experienced so much angst for nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when the conditions were much more favorable and reasonable to use nukes, that it would be very politically difficult to use them again. Meanwhile, also look at Russia. First of all, I'm a huge believer in Zyhan's theories that Russia will not survive the next 10 years as a country. They are the modern equivalent of feudalism, with an extremely bizarre and dysfunctional economic, political, and social system that creates many reasons for revolution. At the same time, due to their horrifying birth rate, they have basically no choice besides facing a horrifying civil war, social collapse, and more. Countries cannot survive with a majority of their population elderly, especially countries that aren't really rich like Russia. The chances of a unified Russia surviving, in my opinion, over the next 10 years is pretty low, and there's a good chance Russia will spend this entire century in a warring states period split between warlords, maybe even with Muslims and Chinese gobbling up and colonizing parts of the country. This state collapse does come with a threat of a different kind of nuclear war, which we'll talk about towards the end of the video. The only real worry is that the Russians get desperate as their society is collapsing and go full nuclear as a Götterdämmerung. I don't think this is super likely. I could see them nuking, let's say, Kiev out of spite, and the Americans wouldn't respond to that since Ukraine's not our ally, and ending the human race is not worth it. The thing is, Russia is so outmatched against the Western world, as we've seen by their military, even being defeated by Ukraine, for Christ's sake, that even going for this extreme option won't work. Something I'll throw in here for a hot second is that across the whole 21st century, we're expecting populations around the world to collapse, probably stabilizing around half of what they currently are. And expansionist wars almost always occur when populations are in periods of growth, so the chances that we'll have major wars of expansion over this century are pretty low. This brings up a key exception that no country will take the nuclear option, since the US, as far as I understand, has such a clear advantage that it's not worth it. Something I must admit is I am not privy to the top secret documents and projects going on in the Great Powers programs. She doesn't call me up every day and say, "Yo, Rudyard, this is my new missile program." The US might have secret weaknesses or advantages I don't know about, or maybe the Chinese have a pulse weapon or cyber offensive that can neutralize America's electrical grid and nukes that I don't know about. The US has a missile defense system named THAAD. And isn't that so perfect? The boomers who named it have no idea what that means for people our age. The THAAD defense system can knock out half of the missiles attacking Europe, the Far East, and North America by targeting those missiles with a counter missile that will blow it up in the air, which is super sick. Our rivals, the Chinese and Russians, have no equivalent. If either country were to start a nuclear rivalry with America, they would just lose, and so they have no incentive to do so. There are also hypersonic missiles, which move so fast that THAAD can't stop them. However, as I understand it, the Chinese only have one of these, and the US has none. We don't even know if it's operational. From actions like this, whether our lack of knowledge if our nukes even work, the Chinese only having one hypersonic missile, or how the world's supply of nukes is a quarter of what it was 40 years ago, I hope you can see how the world's governments don't really treat nuclear war as an actual option. To show why, let's look at China. As the Chinese have drastically grown their military over the last 10 years to militarily compete with America, their nukes have not been a major area of concern. This is since the Chinese would be insane to try to compete with America when it comes to nukes. America has 5,000 nukes, and China 300. As said before, there's THAAD, but also China has 4 times America's population and a much larger industrial base. I don't want to see how many tanks the Chinese can churn out if they want to. The Chinese know that the Americans don't want to start a nuclear holocaust, and so if they start a war, they are incentivized to wage a conventional on-the-ground war, since that's the only way they can get an advantage over the Americans. In its own cynical way, we're actually in a great position, where the public's fear of nuclear war makes wars much more politically dangerous and scary, and thus less likely, but also the actual statistical chance of having a nuclear war is pretty low. low. If the US and China have a war, I think it will be with conventional weapons, since both sides will do lots of saber-rattling and threatening to further their cause, but it's in neither side's self-interest. Another point to make is that America, China, and Russia are so far apart that it gives the Americans even less reason to use nukes. If China's big rival was Japan today instead, the Japanese might use nukes, since the worst that could happen is the Chinese conquer and enslave the Japanese nation. That will never happen to America, since it's on the other side of a massive ocean, where all the cost is borne by America's allies. America is extremely disincentivized from getting into a nuclear war, since it's literally the only way American civilians could get hurt. However, it's even more than this, in that if we had a nuclear war, it would be a lot less disastrous than people imagine. For those of you which saw my video on the BRICS, it's a lot like that, where people thought the BRICS were destined to rule the world, since a couple social interests were incentivized to make people believe that, and no one was incentivized to push the reality that these countries weren't all that. A combination of military interests looking for funding and environmental types have been incentivized to make nuclear war look much more dangerous than it actually is. There's no pro-nuclear war lobby, and so people never hear the other side of the story. Well, I guess it's my job to play the closest thing to devil's advocate and be a pro-nuclear war defendant in this story. People's views on nuclear radiation remind me of the insane traveler's tales you got in the Middle Ages, where people in Europe believed there was a war between dragons and elephants in India, or kingdoms of dog people in an island off Africa. People took things that were real and then exaggerated them to the point of ludicrousness. I mean, look at what Fallout or Marvel think radiation does. The reality is that radiation doesn't cause completely bizarre mutations like this. Most of these are fake, and even if it does, it's on an extremely, extremely rare basis. It's more to do with genetics that does this stuff normally on a bit more frequent. The main thing is that it does cause cancer, often at really heartbreaking rates, but it's pretty similar to diseases in the pre-modern world which targeted children or the elderly most, and communities can survive that pretty sustainably. Keep in mind that in the pre-modern world it was normal for over 2/3 of the population to die of disease on a generational basis, and for plagues to kill half the population every couple hundred years. If radiation after a nuclear war did the same thing, the human race and society in general would survive. Also, radiation does not have incredibly long-lasting effects. Chernobyl is now one of the most biodiverse places in Europe after humans left, with a wonderful forest that has bear, moose, bison, and lynx. Nature recovers incredibly fast. These animals do have cancer, but this largely winnows out the children and the elderly, not the population that works or breeds, so that communities can survive. Most nuclear bombs are also much weaker than people give them credit for, and even more so since they're poorly maintained. The bombs that blew up Hiroshima and Nagasaki wouldn't even able to irradiate the whole island of Manhattan. Modern nukes are much more powerful today, but most nukes are not of the largest variety, and the Russians were planning on dropping 2 or 3 nukes just to get the whole New York City metro area during the Cold War. It would probably take even more for the giant Asian cities that are much larger than even New York, such as Tokyo or Mumbai. For many of you, if you're living in a suburb, there's a big chance you'll be fine, especially if you're to the west of your city, since winds normally blow east in the northern hemisphere. Also, there's this idea of nuclear winter, or that a nuclear war would mess up the atmosphere and cause a horrifying several-year period with no winter. A real Ragnarok. In Cold War models, 1 billion people were expected to die from the initial nuclear war and another billion from the nuclear winter that would follow. The thing is that we don't know either way, and it could change, but the current computer models we've had for the last few decades say that this won't happen at all, there won't be any nuclear winter, and the world's climactic system would not be affected at all. At the height of the Cold War, the estimates were that a nuclear war would kill something around 1 billion people. However, the numbers due to nuclear arsenals collapsing in size now stands at 300 million. That sounds like a really high number, and it is 5 times as much as the bloodiest war in history, World War II. But when you look at just India and China, who would likely get involved in a nuclear war, have a total combined population of 3 billion people, you realize 300 million's not that many. The horrifying thing is that China or India could fight a war, lose 150 million each, which they wouldn't since neither country has a nuclear arsenal of any real size, and then keep going, fighting a war for years with those kinds of losses. A horrifying point to make is that in many nuclear war scenarios, countries could just shrug off the pain and keep going. It's pretty common in the pre-modern world for countries to sustain horrifying losses during wars. Even though the Black Death was a huge factor, France's population in 1420 was half of what it was in 1350, over the course of the 100 Years' War. Germany lost 1/3 of its population in the 30 Years' War, and China was the same with the Mongol and Manchu invasions. Rome lost a majority of its male upper class in the Second Punic Wars. These countries all kept their national identities, stayed unified, and rebuilt pretty quickly. There is a certain difference in how urbanized the industrial world is, however. In most countries, if you nuked the major cities, that's 80+% of the population, compared to the pre-industrial world where 90% of the population was rural and grew their own food. A big reason Mao Zedong was so liberal with nukes was China was so rural it would be hard to kill that many Chinese at the time through nuclear warfare. I think there's a very plausible scenario where a nuclear war today causes mass civilizational collapse like the fall of Rome, and a big reason why is that people today are totally dependent upon food grown very far away, and a nuclear war like this would cause major collapses in the supply chain system. The worst part of nuclear wars, in my opinion, are actually biological weapons. I've read enough history that disease really scares me, given it easily killed 100 times as many people as war in the pre-modern world. Not all the Russian nuclear warheads pointed at America during the Cold War were carrying nuclear bombs. Some were biological. The Russians had genetically engineered a version of the Black Death and a couple others that modern science was immune to, that they were willing to fire on America in a war. It would be so ironic and so true to our character if we humans beat the horrifying plagues of the pre-modern world, only to let the genie out of the bottle again ourselves. You can't keep Pandora from opening the box or Eve from eating the fruit of knowledge, I guess. So far in this video, we've just been talking at the near future. However, over the long term, what are the chances of a nuclear war happening in, for example, the next 1,000 years? I don't know, but here are some of my thoughts. The first is that we humans are kinda dumb, and if we go a long time without using nukes, people might forget how scary they are. Their invention is still in living memory, and so people today are still in shock about them. I think the chances that some ruler will use nukes over the next 1,000 years are pretty high just for this reason. The amount of fanatics over history is large enough that the chances some nutjob gets nukes are high. Although Mao Zedong is one of the most psychotic people ever in history, and he had nukes and never used them. People like to say that nuclear bombs have stopped war forever. I think this is laughable. The core truth of all history and time is Darwinistic competition, which occurs at every single level of society through dating, the free market, or wars between nations. People need Darwinistic competition to keep things real, and nations without external opponents fall to tyranny, social collapse, and decadence every single time. The world changes, and with it politics must change. Imagine how irrational it would be if we just chose to freeze borders in 1800 arbitrarily. India would still be a British colony, the Russian Empire would still exist, and the Spanish would still control all of Latin America, including Texas and California. Conquest, empires, and war are all necessary to rebalance the global political ecosystem. Thus, the decision our society made in 1945 to ban any border transfers and wars is just insane. You can't maintain it. The only people I find who argue that we will never have a war in the future are those without history background. If you read enough history, you see how political orders become stagnant and need war. Imagine a Europe where World War I never happened and all the 19th century social orders existed today. There have been eras of peace as long and longer than the current one that has gone on since World War II, with some examples being the 19th century or the 200-year Pax Romana. Remember when people said war in Europe was impossible and now Russia's in Ukraine? Long peaces like this are normally a function of a hegemonic superpower making war irrational for most other players, whether Britain, Rome, or America, rather than goodwill or moral advancement on the part of the people involved. I hope this video has shown how countries can have nuclear weapons and not wage a nuclear war, and even if they tried, there's a solid chance history would just continue. However, once we know that war is necessary, it also makes the chances of nuclear war higher, since we know we'll have to have wars. There are several mitigating factors to look at, though. The first is that military technology changes extremely rapidly. In the industrial world, the balance of military technology, and with it the geopolitical implications that come from it, radically change every few decades. In the industrial world, the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War all took place in the course of a single lifetime. But the balance of war and strategy was radically changed by how technology did for each of those wars. predicting the future of military technology is up there for one of the hardest jobs ever. However, I can put a pretty high bet that some military technology will emerge over the next 200 years that will make nuclear weapons obsolete. On top of this, we're getting into some real woo-woo stuff, but on the more obscure and long-form civilizational cycles of history, we're going to be looking at decentralization over the next 1,000 years. The height of centralization on a political level was around the world wars with European colonial empires, and then the bipolar Cold War world, and then the unipolar American-dominated one. And the other height on the economic and social basis around 1990, with giant media and corporations managing everything. All the cultural trends since, though, have been towards decentralization. Whether through the internet, the rise of ex-colonial states, decentralized economics, crypto, terrorist organizations, and like 30 other things. The trend of ruralizing and decentralization, as done through the internet, makes nuclear war significantly less dangerous if it were to occur. This is kind of hilarious, since the internet was originally designed to be a way to deal with nuclear war, based off Isaac Asimov's book The Foundation. If you look at the cycles that civilizations were in around 100 BC, which is roughly the equivalent of where we are in our civilizational cycle, that means that the next 1,000 years will be our equivalent to the Dark Ages, as centralized powers fall apart and are replaced by religion as a unifying force. This is good for nukes, where from the historic parallel, the United States will remain the world's dominant superpower for the next couple hundred years, and Americans really don't like using nukes. Then a new Dark Age follows. The thing is that with decentralized nations, even at their best, they can't do that much. If each of the 50 American states is an independent duchy, even California or Texas can only field a handful of nukes, which is just the equivalent of raising a city in the Middle Ages, and the civilization stays fine. This decentralization is very worrying in a certain regard. Imagine a scenario where Russia splits into competing warlords. Let's say the warlord of Irkutsk might be a fanatic and he gets 40 nukes, but all of the neighboring countries will team up against him, and even at its worst, just the major cities of Siberia get nuked and world civilization keeps going. Imagine a rogue actor like a terrorist organization nukes Washington, D.C. The US now enters an unprecedented period of prosperity and freedom. In a decentralized world, no one has the scale to make nukes dangerous. Biological weapons are another matter, but that's a different video. It's the equivalent of how in the Second Punic Wars, or the Warring States period, the last civilizational cycles equivalent to our world wars, armies could often number around 300,000 or in the millions. By the time you get to Charlemagne, the largest countries could barely field armies of 10,000. A future Dark Age has benefits, I guess, and I guess that's why the wheel of history lets these things happen. To circle back again, when Vishnu is saying, "I am death, destroyer of worlds," he was showing a young prince why it was his duty to kill in war, even though he did not want to. Vishnu brought him on a great journey across the cosmos, showing him millions of years of history, a million suns, and the vastness of the cosmos. He did this to show how, in that deep perspective, it was good for him to kill. This degree of nuance is what I, as a Christian, admire about the Hindus. Finishing this topic makes me understand more of Vishnu. By looking into nuclear war, we get to the point that saying a nuclear war wouldn't be the end of the world. Maybe like the Black Death or fall of Rome, a better world would come from it. From looking through this far-removed vision, we see how we could end up cheering on the next Dark Age to prevent a nuclear war.